And I am joined today with our great presenters, Jenna Tyne and Naomi Weinstein, who are back talking with us about harm reduction. This webinar, though, is slightly different. This is harm reduction. We're calling this Harm Reduction 103. So we're going to focus on a very, very brief review of Harm Reduction 101 and 102, and we'll then review a few questions that have come our way since those presentations, and then we're going to open it up to you, our audience, to ask our presenters any questions you may have around harm reduction. So maybe you'd like more support in implementing harm reduction strategies, or maybe you have specific questions to ask them. So we're going to ask you to raise your hands or actually chat in. I'll take you through that process when we get there. We're going to ask you to chat in your questions so that we can gather an order so that we make sure that all the questions are actually answered if possible. So I'm just going to orient everyone to our WebEx system. If you haven't been with us before, welcome, and welcome again if you have been. So you'll see all of the features kind of hovering on the bottom. That's where you can see a chat box. You can chat to our host, Foom, if you have any technical assistance needs during today's event. And you can also chat with her questions or myself, as we will be tracking the questions during today's webinar. Once again, thank you so much for joining us. We are so grateful to have Jenna and Naomi join us again, and I'm going to pass it over to them. Thank you both.
All right, thank you. Hello, everyone. So that voice is Jenna, and I'm Naomi. And I guess I want to say, first, I'm really grateful to have this opportunity to talk to everybody to really answer actual questions. I know when we do presentations, we're always trying to anticipate what people are thinking, but this is actually an opportunity to hear what you're thinking and what your thoughts and, what we can answer for you. So what we want to just start off really quickly with is just kind of where we're going today. So we're going to just talk about the key points that we mentioned in the prior two webinars, and then we're moving really quickly into the Q&A. And the Q&A is what we're hoping is going to be more of an interactive conversation. And then we'll just give you a little bit of information about upcoming events. So just as a reminder for those of you who were hopefully hearing us on the original webinar that we did, so the basic idea is harm reduction is not only about safe continued use. It is a full range of responses to risk behavior: total abstinence, reduced use, as well as safer continued use. So that's the first point. The second point we made was about how people feel judged. And when people feel judged, they just stop connecting, because who wants to feel judged? We don't like that with our friends. We don't like that with people that we meet in any kind of situation, and so we stay away. And that means that people may end up getting involved in more risky behaviors because they're not connecting. And when we are focusing on avoiding judgment, we allow for alternate outcomes. Third point is that people know themselves best. They know what they've been working through. They know what has worked for them, what hasn't worked for them, and we should not presume to know better than they do about what will work for them. A fourth point is that our priority is safety. Safety is more important than judgment. Safety is more important than good manners. Safety is more important than our opinions. Safety is first. And the fifth point that we made in the first webinar is that harm reduction strategies can be used throughout the continuum of interaction with individuals. It's a critical part of engagement. We use it during assessment, treatment planning, as well as service delivery. In our second webinar, we talked again, we're really clear, the priority is safety, not judgment. We talked a little bit about the fact that many people see themselves as chronic failures. Their kind of personal narrative is one of failure, not as success. And when you think that you're always going to fail at something, you may not be so willing or interested or up for the challenge of making a difficult change. And so it's really important to help people feel that they have the agency, that they have the capacity and the competency to make change.
And just to make one point here, I think the way that ties into harm reduction is that, the initial sort of concrete harm reduction interventions that we talked about are a way for people to build their self-efficacy. Because you're not judging the use, you're saying, hey, I recognize this is a part of how you cope with things, function in life, move through the world. I'm going to give you some concrete things you can do to actually care for yourself, right? And for some people, they've never had that experience before.
Absolutely. This is, the third point here is pretty obvious for anyone who's been around a little bit, in that we've talked a lot about the fact that people aren't always willing to make changes immediately, and we can always reflect on ourselves and what happens when the doctor tells us we should eat fewer calories, fewer carbs, less salt, and we're like, yeah, tomorrow. So we have to think about that stages of change theory, that trans-theoretical model. And then the last point that we were making was about the usefulness or the essential element of motivational interviewing strategies, because it's a very person-centered approach to helping elicit people's interest and commitment to change. So some of the key strategies that we use in motivational interviewing from a harm reduction perspective are affirmations, which again is about that sense of personal narrative as a chronic failure, decisional balance, recognizing that there are pros and cons to both changing and not changing, and readiness rulers as a way of moving people along gradually those stages of change.
Yeah, so most of that refers to sort of helping someone resolve their ambivalence.
Exactly. So that's what we talked about in the prior two webinars. So now we're going to, as I said, move quickly into the Q&A section. So the first question that we had was, or statement, I was left wondering about the disease concept of addiction and how that plays into harm reduction. So you want to start, Jenna?
Sure. So I really love this question. When I talk about myself as a harm reductionist, one of the things that I talk about is that being a harm reductionist allows me to have a toolbox that contains multiple concepts. So if I have someone in front of me who is a believer in the disease concept of their, their substance misuse disorder, then I join them there. The disease concept is not counterintuitive in the harm reduction model, right? So I'm going to meet the person where they're at. I'm not going to try to change their belief in the moment about their substance use disorder, right? Because again, I'm focusing on safety. So if there's some way that I can use the disease model to help them to use, in terms of motivational interviewing, then I'm going to go there with it. So I think the main point in that is that they are not mutually exclusive. You can believe in the disease model in harm reduction.
Well, it's interesting to me. So in my background in drug treatment, we often talked about the disease concept as a way of getting out of the judgment. So I guess I'm wondering, in what you're saying, Jenna, would you share that disease concept with an individual if they're not ascribing to it at the outset?
I tend not to. I tend to just focus on assessing, because everyone has some belief about the origin of their substance use, right? I have a lot of individuals that I work with now, because trauma-informed care is a very popular thing right now. A lot of clients, 10 years ago didn't talk about how they're sort of quote-unquote self-medicating their trauma, and I hear that much more now. So I don't like to bring concepts to individuals. I like to assess, and if, as I'm assessing, it sounds like what they believe is the disease concept, then for sure I'll help them formulate it in that way. But I try very hard not to put any of my own sort of frameworks on top of their use, again, because they're the expert. So if I'm not really sure what they believe about it, I just sort of roll with it until, they trust me enough to give me tidbits for me to put the whole picture together. Because sometimes in the first few meetings, people aren't going to really disclose how they feel about their use, right? Because many times their use is tied to traumatic events. It's tied to being trans-institutionalized across institutions, right? Starting in foster care, ending up in the criminal justice system, then the mental health system, right? And so can you never do it? I wouldn't say you could never do it. I think you really have to look at the person in front of you and what they're presenting with.
So you're really talking about being a mirror. You're just reflecting back wherever they are, and maybe being a magic mirror where you can help shape things but you're not the teacher instructing something that's a foreign concept to them and trying to convince them.
Correct. I like the mirror analogy, right? So when I'm the mirror, it might be a little fuzzy, and I'm just trying to make it come in clearer for them, right? If necessary. Some people don't need a framework to understand their substance use, right? When I give them the tools they need, if I say, okay, so you're using cocaine, but you came up positive for fentanyl, I'm really concerned because you don't actually want to use an opioid. Let me give you fentanyl test strips. That's sort of a way to start the conversation around how they experience their substance use, right? So again, using those concrete tools and joining them where they are in terms of what they'd like to do to keep themselves safe.
Well, it's interesting, you think about the power of having an ally as opposed to an adversary.
Yep.
And the way you're talking, Jenna, is about being an ally in their thinking no matter where they are.
Correct.
I like that.
Truly meeting them where they're at.
Okay. So the next question that we had, how do you recognize your own bias and then step aside from it?
So we talked a little bit about this before this started, because I think this is one of the more challenging questions to answer. I think there's a few ways to recognize your bias. One is through really good supervision, if you have that accessible to you, and sort of bringing up and talking about countertransferential feelings that come up, right? There's always some sort of clue that there's a bias happening. And, you know, it's very difficult to step aside from it. I think the most important thing is the first part of this question is how do you recognize it, right? Because once you recognize it, you can be aware of it, and you can be hyper aware of how it might play out in your practice, whether non-verbally, verbally, through your actions. And again, this is probably the hardest part about doing harm reduction work. I've been a harm reductionist since I started my career, but even early on, there were things that I would hear, and I'd be like, oh my God, like, wait, what? We're going to do what? And it just sort of over time, you, through, again, good supervision and good mentorship, I can't speak about that enough, have an ability to sort of unpack your own stuff, right? Because it's what you're bringing to it as well.
I mean, it makes me think about, I wish there was some sort of, you know, almost like a self-help book that takes you through a process. Yeah, so what are the sources of your bias? So if your parents used substances growing up and that created problems for you, probably you've got some strong feelings about somebody else using substances and their ability or inability to change their behavior.
Absolutely.
If you've got close friends, family, you know, any of that stuff. If you were ever in a car accident because of a drunk driver, chances are you got some strong feelings about this stuff, right?
And I don't even think sometimes that it's, right, because there's implicit bias. And there are ways, I wish, maybe what I'll do is I'll send to Kara, there is an entire website that you can take tests on your implicit bias.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh, good.
Around many, many, many different subjects. And so for everybody on the line today, I will send it to Kara for her to send out, because I've even been taking some of them and kind of shocked at what I'm seeing in these tests, right? Because implicit bias is sort of just how you're socialized. And we are all socialized, right? We live in a society where for as long as I've been alive, there's been a war on drugs. And how that has played out. I'm a child who went through DARE. Right? So, you know, I think that we are all socialized, right? So much so that DARE was very popular in the school system, right? And it was a just say no model. There was nothing about how drugs work, what they do for people, how to stay safe, like all of the things that we want to use, the tools we want to use with our clients now, none of us were socialized to think that way.
And so I guess I'm thinking about that piece of it. So there's the bias piece, and then there's the second piece, which is the stepping aside from it. And truth be told, you can't step aside from it, right? We have those biases. The question is, how do we wrestle with them and make sense of them and be aware of them? And then what are the things that we do that display our biases? And I was explaining to Jenna this morning, I was talking with a colleague who has a clinical practice, and he was talking about somebody who had a child involved in the child welfare system, and also uses marijuana. And I asked, well, why does she use marijuana? And he said, well, her excuse is this. And I stopped and I said, wait a second, word choice. It wasn't an excuse, it was her reason, her thinking, she reports, she stated all sorts of other things. But when he used the word excuse, it was a very clear display of this is bad, that is good.
Yep.
And what are all the different ways we think about this?
Yep.
And I guess we can also use as a corollary how we think about racial bias.
Correct.
Right?
Absolutely.
Religious bias.
All of it.
Gender bias. And we're constantly wrestling, I think, in this day and age at least, with how we are affirming, supportive, or whatever, and when we make mistakes.
Yeah.
And what do we do when we make a mistake?
So that's what I was just going to say, right? Because one of the things I tell all my supervisees is, there's very few things that you can do in our field that are wrong, right? There's the big ones, like you don't overstep certain boundaries.
Right.
But in terms of talking to somebody, there is therapeutic value in if you make a mistake, in correcting yourself in the moment. And if you don't recognize that you made a mistake, you can always go back to it, right? So I've had sessions where I am having a conversation with somebody and then I go home or I'm taking the train and I'm replaying my whole day and I'm like, oh man, I really wish that I had done X, Y, and Z differently. I just start the next session by saying, after that day I was on my way home. One, it conveys that I still think about my clients and my practice after I'm not with them. And two, it's okay to make a mistake and correct it. Right? I think some of our best clinical moments happen when we make a mistake and then correct it.
I like that idea of, showing vulnerability.
Correct.
And showing equality and parity.
Yeah, I'm just very honest about it, right? I mean, honesty, particularly when you're talking about people who use substances, so much of the field is set up to sort of make them dishonest in ways, right? So I feel like I need detox, but I'm using mostly cocaine, so I'm going to drink a beer before I...
Right, because how hard can that be?
So, right, so because to get in,
Right,
you have to have alcohol in your system, right? So much of what we've set up is around little white lies to get what you need, that I try to be extra honest about what I'm doing in my process.
Yeah. Let me just clarify for those of you on the phone. In terms of detox is, insurance will cover detox for alcohol, for opiates, and benzodiazepines. So things like cocaine and marijuana will not be an admissible substance. So people will sometimes, to get into a detox program, if they're cocaine users, for example, they will do something to get them in, which means they have to test positive for something. That's what we were talking about. This is a very complicated and interesting question, and yet I think it's something that we're all struggling with all the time.
Yeah, and I've been doing this for a long time. I consider myself a harm reductionist, and I still struggle with this. Each new experience I have sort of brings to the surface some biases that I wasn't even aware that I had, or language that I need to change. And really sort of staying on top of what's happening in practice, because language and terminology that we use does change so frequently, what's appropriate. And so just really being thoughtful and continuing your education around language and the newest sort of things.
Yeah, and not just language, but also things like, body language and...
Nonverbals are huge, right? Yeah. Nonverbals are huge.
Yeah. All right, Joe, the next question. So the third prepared question that we have is, how do you practice harm reduction with a pregnant woman when you know that the substances can harm her growing baby? So there's some interesting bias in the question itself, right? So do you want to start taking it?
So I think right, this is a question that comes up quite frequently when you're a harm reductionist. So, there's an assumption in here that substances harm the baby, right? So most of the time, it's not actually the substance that is harming the development of the fetus. It really is the lifestyle that comes with sort of very chaotic substance use. And in many, many cases, it's actually harmful for the baby if the person stops the drug use cold turkey, quote unquote, cold turkey. And so again, thinking about safety and focusing on safety, I will always make a referral to a medical provider, and I'm very lucky that I have relationships with medical providers who understand harm reduction. But I think that's a very tricky thing as well, because most pregnant women, the last thing they want to do is come into contact with the medical settings, because they know the results of coming into contact with medical settings, right? So in that sort of dilemma in and of itself requires some level of harm reduction, right? Helping somebody understand the need for prenatal care, particularly in the context of youth, but also helping them find medical providers who understand what's happening.
Well, it gets, I was writing that down as a note as we were talking, but I'm also thinking about just the judgment that you get from everybody in your world when you're pregnant, about anything you do.
About anything.
You saw kids, you know, I remember having, when I was pregnant, I remember having some pasta sauce one night that had white wine in it. And I was yelled at by 3 people sitting at a table. I was 9 months pregnant. There was nothing that was going to happen with the quarter ounce of white wine that was in the pasta sauce that had burned off. And yet everyone had a really strong opinion about what I was doing. I think we have, when somebody is pregnant, it doesn't matter if the people are substance users or not. They have a lot of thoughts about the substance's influence or impact on the baby.
Yes.
One of the things that we do know is that from the substance abuse perspective, that the postnatal environment can actually do a lot of fixing from whatever happened during the prenatal environment. So that's one really important point. Jenna was talking about the fact that change is more risky for a fetus than having a stable environment. And while there is neonatal abstinence situations, right, if the child has been, for example, exposed to opiates or stimulants or whatever in utero, there is also the reality that can A, be managed, and B, there's the reality that dosing actually may have to go up for something like methadone. So someone who's in a methadone program who is pregnant, A, we like pregnant women being in methadone programs because they're getting seen by a nurse every single day.
And they know what they're getting. They know what they're ingesting.
Exactly. And there's experts there who know that you may have to have split doses of methadone. You may have to have an increased dosage because of the changing hormonal situation and everything else. So the pregnancy and harm reduction piece is really complicated. I think the other piece to mention, though, is, as I've learned from you, Jenna, harm reduction includes a very clear and open discussion of all risks. And you can talk about the risks of substances for the fetus as well as part of your discussion about motivating for change. We know a lot of women stop smoking cigarettes, for example, when they're pregnant for good because they're motivated at that point. Right? So we need to think about all those things. And many people will say, like, the only time I was ever drug-free was the 9 months I was pregnant. Well, that's great.
Yeah.
You were able to do it. How can we do that again if that's where you want to go? So there's a lot of possibilities inherent in that pregnancy period.
Yep, absolutely. And building self-efficacy, right?
Yeah.
I think you also have to go into it, right? Again, I think this goes back to sort of our implicit bias, right? Or really not implicit bias, just bias in general, that you have to go into it recognizing that every woman wants to do the best thing for their child.
Absolutely.
Right? So if you go into it with that sort of orientation to it, that's going to come across in your work with the person. And from a harm reduction perspective, I get to have a lot of conversations that I wouldn't otherwise get to have around substance use and the fetus, right? So a lot of people who are in abstinence programs, they're going to tell you that they're abstinent even if they're not, right? And that doesn't leave you much room to have those conversations about safety, about reducing use, about managing use. And that is the critical time when you really want to be able to have those conversations.
Right. And that officially, I think, And yes, that and the pre-prepared questions. So, Carrie, do you want to explain what's going to happen now?
Sure. Hi, everyone. So this is what we're going to do. We already have a few questions, Jenna.
Great.
Naomi. So what we're going to do is we're asking everyone to chat in questions to the host or myself, and then we're tracking them. And so we can unmute you to actually have a conversation with Jenna and Naomi, or we can just ask the question. So we'll start with Yael. He asked, how does one apply the harm reduction model to sexually reactive behavior? So do we want to unmute you? Foong was asking if he wants.
Yeah, sure, yeah. That sounds great.
Okay.
Hi.
So we'll unmute Yael, and you can ask your question to Jenna and Naomi.
Hello?
Hi. Yael, are you there? I think you've been unmuted on our end. I think you have to unmute your line, unless you'd rather just chat with us. Oh, okay. So the unmuting isn't really working right now for him.
All right. Okay.
So maybe we'll just attend to his question. How does one apply the harm reduction model to sexually reactive behavior?
Same.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I would wonder what specifically sexually reactive means. But, you know, harm reduction, one of the first areas that it was applied to was around sexual behaviors and HIV/AIDS reduction, right? So it's sort of the same thing. We have these very, you know, taboo subjects in terms of the rest of society, which drugs, sex, those things tend to be conversations that people don't feel comfortable having. So coming from a harm reduction perspective and looking at the safety issues around sexual behaviors, again, going back to what we said in the first and second webinars around thinking about where are the safety concerns if somebody is having risky sexual behaviors, you know, and assessing where is it coming from, in what ways have they protected themselves and others in the past, what are some of the barriers, right? Because we're pretty clear about safety around sexual behavior. And so what are the barriers to utilizing the current measures that they're being offered? I just got back from the harm reduction conference, and my husband, who's also a social worker, went to a presentation on older adults and harm reduction. And there was a conversation about when you're an older adult and you're not quite as agile as you used to be, how do you continue to have sexual relations that are safe for you physically?
Oh, interesting.
Right? Like if you've had a hip surgery, because we tend to assume that older adults don't have sex when we know that they do, right? So if you're an older gay man, how do you have sex after a hip surgery, right? And
we thought about that.
Well, I never even thought about that. My husband came back and was like, I've never thought about that. And it was like, we had this big, long discussion about how both of us had biases against older adults, like that we don't even think of them as sort of sexual beings anymore, when in reality, they are, right? And I think we tend to do the same thing with our clients who have mental health diagnoses. We tend not to see them as these independent sexual beings, when in reality, they are.
Right. I mean, I think one of the things, if you think about it, so let's, I'm going to make some presumptions, like what sexually reactive behavior means. So to me, I guess sexually reactive behavior could encompass people who have learned to be emotionally expressive primarily through sexual expression, people who may be engaged in, I don't even know what else. If you can explain a little bit more about what sexually reactive means, that would be helpful. But I think, you know, we think about the same tools for safe sex. So if I have someone, for example, who is, say, 18 and keeps meeting people online and going to strangers' houses to have sex, I'm starting to think about the risks involved in having sex with strangers. So there's health risks, there's violence risks, there's theft risks, Mm-hmm. So I want to make sure that when this teenager goes out of the house, I have a way of getting in touch with him or her.
Mm-hmm.
I want to make sure that there's some sort of buddy system, that maybe there's an app on his or her phone that I'm in an emergency.
Yep.
I want to make sure that this person knows about condoms and other kinds of tools to have safe sex.
Yep.
I want to make sure that the person has checked out whoever it is online so they're not going into the serial killer's home.
Correct.
And I'm not going to judge whether or not they should be having sex. It's not my business.
Yep. Also, I mean, just a few more, right, because I worked for many years with homeless and at-risk youth, making sure that they wear things that they can easily get away in, that they're not wearing 6-inch heels, right, because you can't run in 6-inch heels very well, although some of my girls would tell me I can run just fine in 6-inch heels. You know, that they have a little bit of extra money if they need to take a cab or that they can take Uber, right? Like, it's ways to remove themselves from the situation. And I think about it.
Fully charged phone.
Exactly. I think about it very much in the same way that I think about the way I talk to my outreach workers to do home visits. Right? You've got a point of contact, someone knows where you are, your phone is charged, you have a Metro card if you need to leave.
Yep.
And at any point, if you feel unsafe, just remove yourself.
Yep. Yep.
Right? So it's very similar concept.
I think we're getting feedback.
All right,
so
we get a little bit of feedback, so if somebody can put their phone on mute, that'd be helpful.
I think everybody should be muted. We're trying to mute people, so it's a little challenging. Foom, are you there?
Yes.
Everyone unmuted? Is everyone muted?
Yes. If I was just unmuting to allow Yael to speak.
Okay.
Which is why there's feedback. So
I don't think it's going to work.
Now,
I'm
going to unmute him now so he can talk, which is why there's feedback.
So it may not work. So
Hello. Yes, does that work? Okay, fantastic. So.
Better, thanks.
Yeah, there's just way too much feedback. I'm so sorry. That happens if you're on your computer and your telephone. But I do have your follow-up question here, so I can speak for you, and because we've been chatting with each other as you've been talking, because I want to make sure that her question was properly answered. And
right.
So the follow-up is, I would like to ask about heterosexual teenage boys specifically, especially with the risk of pregnancy that doesn't necessarily directly affect them. Additionally, I wanted to ask about how a provider might react to sexually charged behaviors directed at her.
So, I mean, I think with heterosexual young men, a lot of it is education. And again, I would do a full assessment on, because it's not just about pregnancy, right? If you're not protecting yourself, there are other consequences. There are other STIs. And so I have a big conversation about that. It's really not just about pregnancy, although that is a huge part of the conversation. And you're going to do some motivational interviewing around their goal, right? So if their goal is not to have a child in the world that they, feel like they don't have to care for, then there has to be some conversation around how do you make that happen? And some of those ways, right? Because we know what it is, that young heterosexual males don't want to wear condoms. Right? That's pretty much what it boils down to 90% of the time. And so some of that is their friend group, some of that is culturally, and so sort of assessing where that comes from and then utilizing motivational interviewing because they don't really want to put a child. You have to sort of believe in the good in people and that they don't purposely want to go around impregnating women and having children.
Girls.
Girls. That they plan on not caring for. And I think it is tricky. I think young adults are the hardest group of individuals to do harm reduction with because They're very young. They haven't seen the full consequences of their behavior. And even when they do see the full consequences, there's that invincibility aspect to being 17, 18, 19, right? And so I think that's a very hard thing to try to work against, even from a harm reduction perspective.
I think the adolescent boys, the heterosexual adolescent boys where the consequences are the slimmest are such a challenge.
And not even heterosexual, I would say all young men, right? Because I work with a lot of LGBT youth, and they don't see, right, because people don't die from AIDS like they did in the 90s. They don't see that consequence.
Right.
And so, again, it's really focusing on consequential thinking, which harm reduction embraces 100%, right? Because if you don't help them have consequential thinking, you can't decide what the concrete interventions are to bring them to safety.
Right. And especially because their main goal may be bragging rights.
Correct.
Bragging rights and sexual satisfaction as opposed to anything else.
Correct. But there are consequences to bragging rights. There are consequences to satisfaction in that way.
Yes.
Right?
Exactly.
And I think the second part of the question about young men having, I guess, sexual transference with the person that they're working with.
Yes.
I don't know how much of this is from a harm reduction perspective, but I address it in the room immediately and put it out there as something that I see happening. I think avoiding it. One, the youth knows that you know it's happening, and so you just have to address it immediately. And sometimes when working with young adults, I'll actually bring it up first if I have any inkling that there's anything happening, because I want to be the one to direct the conversation, and a lot of times they're not going to bring it up verbally. They're going to bring it up through behaviors. They're going to bring it up through their nonverbals, and so I want to start sort of the verbal process of it as early as possible.
Okay, great.
I hope that was helpful.
Sounds good. Sounds great. Thank you. We have a lot of other questions coming in. Is it okay if I move to the next one?
Yep.
Absolutely.
Okay, the next question is around pornography as an addiction. And the question is, what is your opinion on using harm reduction for clients who view too much pornography when they believe watching it is better than acting upon their urges? Have any of you utilized harm reduction for sexual addiction?
So yes, I have. Again, I think it's really important in the assessment piece, because if they're watching a lot of pornography, and again, it depends on the type of pornography, because there's different levels of harm, right? If you're watching pornography that, there's a criminal aspect to it, that's a different consequence than if you're watching something that doesn't have a criminal aspect to it, right? And so I always assess how it's impacting sort of all their domains of functioning, their relationship, school, work, spiritually. I talk a lot with my clients who have sexual addictions about what it does to them, and I use spiritually more as sort of how they think about themselves as they move through the world, although some people have a very strong religious component to it, and so addressing that as well. And a lot of times, if it is impacting their day-to-day, right, we talk about how it's impacting their day-to-day. I've had youth that I've worked with where from midnight until 3 a.m., they're on the computer, and then they can't get up and go to school in the morning. So I'm not going to tell them that they can't have their 3 hours of porn. We just start by shifting the time that they're watching it, right? Because we want the problem that they're having is that they now have an ACS case. Their mother's all over their back because they haven't gone to school, right? So that's just one small example of thinking about how the action plays out as a barrier to them reaching their goals, right? This young man wanted to go to school. He just genuinely had this addiction, and so we started by shifting the time. And what I did with him is he shifted his start time and his end time a half an hour earlier each week. And one of the things we found out was that he was doing it from midnight to 3 because everybody else was asleep.
Right.
And so we talked a lot about whether or not he wanted to have a conversation with his mother, whether he wanted to think of ways that he could do it where, right? And one of the things he did was went out and bought headphones, which is so simple, but changes the whole dynamic.
Absolutely.
You know, and so again, going back to really assessing and seeing where people are.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Wonderful. So we're going to move on. We have another question from Jasmine. What are the best harm reduction practices for runaway and homeless youth?
So that's a very broad question. You know, I would say that in terms of runaway and homeless youth, again, if you're thinking specifically about the homelessness, I do a full safety assessment. So I ask where they primarily stay, right? And the top answers I generally get is that they are squatting somewhere abandoned, which was after the Hurricane Sandy. I had a lot of kids in Staten Island who had basically taken over buildings. And when you're thinking about if they're staying in buildings, the first thing I ask is, so it's November, so how are you staying warm? And talking about, you know, there should be no open air fires within the building, right? Because we know that there have been many tragic sort of stories across the country of youth who die in these fires. They stay on the trains, right? So my kids used to call, you know, I don't know if you guys know who Uncle Ace is, the ACE, because it's the longest line and they can stay on it the longest.
New York City subway.
New York City subway, yeah.
We have statewide people.
Oh, right. So in the New York City subway system, there is the line that's called the ACE, and so the youth call it Uncle Ace. So they would tell me they stay with Uncle Ace. And then shelters and or public spaces. And each of those things, I have a little bit of a different assessment process for, right? If they're in public spaces, it's a safety issue. It's a, you know, how do you not come into contact with NYPD? It's giving them some education around when the temperature's a certain degree where they have the right to be, that there are shelters that are open, there are drop-in centers that are open. So again, a very broad question, but if I'm thinking about runaway and homeless youth, I'm really focusing on their living situation. Many youth don't get counted in the homeless youth numbers because in our society, youth is a commodity that can be traded for a place to stay. So many of our youth trade sex or just companionship for a place to stay. And so that's a very different assessment process than if they're staying on the train. So I hope that answers that question. Do you want to say anything else about that?
No. You covered everything.
Okay, thank you. I did check in to see if it answered her question, and we'll find out if it didn't. I'll get back to you.
Okay, great.
But we'll move on. We have a lot of interest for asking questions, which is great. Thank you, everyone, for participating. It's fantastic. We have a question here. Is there work taking place with faith-based communities to help increase awareness?
I mean, I think the faith-based communities are pretty broad, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's really complicated. I guess I'm a whole bunch of different things are swirling in my head.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about the opioid epidemic and how people are dealing with Narcan, and I think some church communities in particular are pretty engaged with this.
Many.
Some synagogues are pretty engaged in it. So I'm imagining some Muslim communities are also
absolutely
very involved. I'm thinking about, at the same time, the complications of judgment and morality and how do we tamp that down and the complications of that.
I mean, so I actually I've had great experiences with faith-based organizations. Like I said, I worked with homeless and precariously housed LGBTQ youth for 10 years, and I ran that program out of a church called St. Luke in the Fields in the Village, and they were, you know, they basically let me create an entire harm reduction program. The only thing that we didn't allow was people using on-site. but there were very few things. I ran that program for 10 years, and in 10 years, there were only 2 youth that were ever asked to not come back, because we did, we looked at things from a harm reduction perspective. If something did happen, if a rule or a guideline was broken, we sort of used a restorative justice approach, and we created, the safest, sort of most welcoming and open program we could in a church setting. And we got money during the Bush administration to do some rebranding. And we hired a consultant who had all these great names for the program. And we went to the youth, and the youth always called it the church, right? It was the only church open on Saturday near the pier. And they actually fought to name it the church, so we went with it. And then as I was doing outreach with my new flyers, I was like, how am I going to sell a program called the church to homeless and precariously housed youth who most have been kicked out because of their families' religious beliefs? And surprisingly, we had very little trouble doing it because we got other youth to come out with us and sort of that peer-to-peer model. So there is, from my experience, I think with the right parish and the right thought process, there is a tremendous amount of work that faith-based organizations can do. And I think it's such a reparative experience for youth to sort of, they walk into this place, and we used to do singing lessons in the actual church with the organ, and it was the first time some of them had stepped into a church in 7 years, 8 years. And many of the youth that came to our program, religion was very prevalent in their lives growing up. And so it's this very interesting dynamic. And I think it's the same thing around substance use, right? Like you get into that moral judgment. But there are many, 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 especially in the New York City area, churches and faith-based organizations that have shelters.
Right. I think the complication, I guess what I'm thinking about in part, is the number of people who are in an abstinence-based recovery, living an abstinence-based recovery model, who are also very involved with their church, and they are very aggressive about their outreach ministries in terms of helping others to enter an abstinence-based recovery.
Oh, absolutely.
And so there gets me a little bit of tension around how do we play this whole thing out.
And some of it is educating the parishes, right? So I had to do a lot of education, not around sort of the youth identifying as LGBT, but sort of the youth substance use. Towards the end of my time there, K2 was huge. Right. And they, the youth would present with almost psychotic symptoms and be very disruptive, and the members of the parish were very frightened by it. Yeah. And so we did very intensive education around substance use. And I think it paid off. I think that once they understood that it was manageable, and that we really were a safe space. This was what we were designed to be. The whole point was that we didn't want them on the pier. We wanted them in a safe space with us, with professionals who could help them in the moment.
Yeah. All right. Next
question. Thank you. Thank you so much. I did have Jasmine asked about best harm reduction practices for runaway and homeless youth. And she came back and felt that she was actually asking more for rural communities, if you have any information there, because there is no transit system. Abandoned buildings are minimal. So wondering if you have any thoughts around harm reduction for runaway and homeless youth in a rural setting.
Yeah, so I mean, I think in rural settings, I imagine what they do is mostly couch surf or public spaces. And so in public spaces, talking about, where, what's the safety concerns around it, depending on the time of year, how do they get the resources they need to actually be safe. And then having conversations about what are the other options. It's a little bit hard for me to think about in rural areas what are other options, and sometimes there are no other options. Even in New York City, where we have a transit system, we have multiple shelters, sometimes youth have sort of burned their bridges in every formal setting, and we end up, you know, at the end of the night when I worked on Saturdays, some of the youth had either aged out of the youth system and were too afraid to go into the adult system, and so our harm reduction technique was swiping them onto the subway. That was really all we had, and it doesn't feel good, and it wasn't the best case scenario, but when I started 10 years ago, there were like 40 beds total for youth, for LGBT youth in the city.
Right.
And so I think it's a little bit more challenging in a rural setting. But again, going back to assessing, thinking about safety, and really in those settings, the safety is how do you survive, literally.
Well, and I think, you know, we've been talking a lot about the living situation, and we've talked a little bit about kind of police contact. Also, though, we're talking about other kinds of behaviors as well, including risky sex.
Yep.
In terms of, you know, that kind of
trading.
Trading behavior. Certainly substance use. And so you're going back to those same core principles of decisional balance and what does it mean for you and how is this helping you and how can I help you use more safely. So if you're a 15-year-old runaway homeless youth and you've been sleeping at the bus station and you get high during the day because of whatever has happened in your life, or at night to stay awake so that nothing happens to you, and we're concerned about police contact and safety and the fact that you don't know your dealer and you're buying from unsafe people, there's a lot of stuff I can work with there in terms of trying to decrease risks. Now, am I going to be able to decrease all the risks in one night? Not a chance. Nope. I'm working very gradually and chipping away at the problem in a way that the young person feels safe and trusting, and I'm not going to screw them over, basically. So I think there's actually a lot of different things.
It's also, I think, you know, this is where the concrete services come in, right? So having socks, having bagged lunches, right? Because it's important that they eat, particularly if they're using. And our homeless youth tend not to spend money on food, right? They spend it on other necessities. For young women who are homeless, we had care packages that included tampons and pads and deodorant, and right, they're young adults. They want to appear as if they are not in the situations that they're in a lot of the times. And so going back to those concrete self-care things so that they can build that self-efficacy.
So that goes back to when we were talking, when we were reviewing earlier about what we've been talking about. Some of the things that we're talking about now are not just assessment and service planning, they're also about the engagement strategies. So the food, the tampons, those are things that help connect and develop trust. And I think those are equally important.
And they show that you understand the humanity.
Absolutely. They're people first.
Okay. Great. Do you know if the safe needle exchange sites that don't really exist here, I know they exist in other countries, do they also offer some of these other things for people?
Yes.
Yep, they do.
Yeah. Great. Because Carol, I can get a list to you of needle exchange programs throughout the state.
I think I'm talking about the safer injection facilities
yeah.
as well. But yeah, they function in a lot of the same ways. The beauty of the SIFs that exist outside of the U.S. is that there's medical staff, right? And there's case managers. So yeah, there is a lot of that.
They're well supported, yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. Just so I'd ask. I think we have time for one more question, and then we have to wrap up. And I want to make sure that we can show some of the things coming up for CTAC. The last question is, how do you get to the root of numbing from trauma with substances? Do you incorporate trauma treatment with harm reduction?
100% you do. I mean, I think so a lot of times when you work in an abstinence model, right, there is people can identify that they're self-medicating trauma, and to go straight from, daily use to abstinence without building any coping skills or self-efficacy before removing the thing that has sort of helped them survive is a recipe for disaster a lot of times. There are people who successfully do it, and I don't want to take away the strength and the determination that takes, but there are a lot of people who can't do that. And so having the conversations around safety literally just opens the conversation up to talking about their use, which once you build that non-judgmental, trusting relationship, you actually can sort of start to address the trauma. And so I think of it a little bit as I am giving them as I'm increasing coping and self-efficacy skills, I'm simultaneously trying to work with them around potentially a goal of reduction of substance use, right? Because the substance use becomes the main and only coping skill. And so sometimes I'll talk about reducing the substance use, not because I feel like they need to stop using, but because in order to test out these new coping skills, they have to not, I'll say to somebody, so, this is a new coping skill, and the next time you are sort of presented with a situation where you normally would just be like, F this whole thing, I'm going to get high, can you put off getting high for a half an hour and try this new coping skill? And I've built relationships where, the individual will say, yeah, I think I can do that, because you're not telling me that I can't then fall back on my use if I want to. You're asking me just to hold off for a half an hour and try something different. And sometimes we have to do that 50 times. Right? And sometimes they'll come back and they'll say 30 minutes, no way. And I'll say, okay, you're right. I went way too fast. Can you put it off for 5 minutes and try this coping skill for 5 minutes, right? So sometimes you have to backtrack. Or they'll come and say half an hour was easy. I actually waited for an hour before I used, and then I give them major props around that, right? That's a huge success because I only asked for a half an hour.
That's a cupcake with a candle.
It really is, right? And they, sometimes, especially when I'm working with youth, they look at me like I have 5 heads because I'm really excited about something that they don't think anybody should be excited about. But that's really how you build that self-efficacy, right? You're giving them props for making a change small and incremental. They don't have to stop using for an entire day. Sometimes not using for 5 minutes is something to celebrate.
Yeah. So I'm just looking at the time, 12:59. Carrie, you want to wrap up?
Yes, I do. Thank you. And I'm sorry, there were some other questions coming in that were really great. You can send them to ctac.info@nyu.edu if we didn't get to your question, and I can pass it on to Naomi and Jenna and hopefully get back to you in some capacity. So thank you, everyone, for participating. And just really wanted to share these things, first of all, resources, and I think we're going to send around some implicit bias trainings that do exist. I've taken those as well. They're amazing. And then we have these upcoming CTAC events that I don't want you all to miss. There's one, we have a clinical intensive with Dr. Monica Williams and Chad Wetternick that's happening. There's a webinar and then an in-person training with a consultation. There's only openings in Albany for the in-person, and so it's a mini course. So if you can go to Albany for the afternoon, we'd love to have you. We have December 5th, Exploring the Intersection of Trauma and Addiction with Priyanka. And that's from 11 to 12 on December 5th. December 6th, we have Youth Peer Advocates, Credential and Training Initiative discussion from Youth Power. And then on December 17th, we have Transgender Youth and Mental Health with Dr. Katz White. So hopefully you all can join some of those initiatives. And again, thank you so very much to both you, Naomi, and Jenna for your time and your energy and your expertise on harm reduction. I think that our participants have really gotten a lot out of their participation in harm reduction offerings. Any last words from either of you?
Thank you.
Thank you. Happy Thanksgiving, everyone.
Oh, great. Same to you. Thank you, everyone. Hope you have a great day. Okay. Take good care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.